After midnight, London ceased to be a city. It did not sleep. It changed its face. There were streets where the police did not enter, quarters where the law ended and life could end in a few minutes. Hundreds of women, dark alleys, gas lamps that lit up just enough so that you could see danger and not run away. One wrong step, one look, one silhouette in the fog, and you disappeared. No one screamed that night, because no one came to help here. This is not a story about sin. This is a story about survival, where the city turned away. And the main question is simple. Could you walk these streets and come out alive? This is not a horror story. This is history. When the city turns away. London knew how to pretend. By day, it was the heart of an empire. Stone, order, form, rules. A city that seemed self-assured. But after midnight, London stopped pretending. There were streets that disappeared with the light. Not on maps, but in the mind. They were not written about in guidebooks. They were not mentioned in newspapers. And, most importantly, they were not patrolled. Here logic ended, and another system began. Silent, rigid, without witnesses. Gaslights were rare. They did not illuminate, they marked boundaries. Light here did not protect, it only showed where you became visible. The air was heavy. Dampness, the smell of alcohol, dirt, cheap perfume. The stone underfoot was slippery as leather. Every step was too loud. And if you were here, it meant you either had no choice or you had already lost it. These neighborhoods were called by different names. Some called them red lights, some called them nightlife, and some were simply places you shouldn't go. Hundreds of women worked here, not because they wanted to, but because London knew how to cut off the paths back. Poverty here was not a background, it was a license to exploit, to rape, to disappear. The police knew about these streets, the city authorities knew, the newspapers knew. But at night, no one wanted to know. Because these places served a function. They absorbed what was not supposed to come to light. Here, no questions were asked. Here, they didn't wait for explanations. Here, they didn't believe words. You either survived, or you became part of the silence. Women here learned not to look at people, but past them. Learned to read footsteps, to distinguish between a shadow that simply passes by and a shadow that stops. The men who came here were also different. Not all of them were criminals, but almost all of them knew. There are no rules here. And that's what made these streets deadly dangerous. One wrong look, one refusal, one silhouette that appeared too close. And you understand, screaming doesn't work here, because the city has already turned its back, and this is just the beginning. Because later we will see exactly how people disappeared and why some deaths were never learned about. Streets that learned to be silent. In these quarters, London was silent. There were no screams here, as in cheap shows. There were no chases. There was no chaos. There was a silence that learned to breathe. When you entered these streets, the first thing that disappeared was the sense of time. The clock ceased to mean anything. Midnight could last for hours, and morning never came. The alleys here were narrow, like cracks in stone. 2 steps, and you could no longer see the main road. 3, and the light of the street lamp disappeared behind you. The houses stood so close that it seemed they were listening. The windows were dark, and if there was a light somewhere, it was not a sign of safety. Light meant presence, and presence meant risk. The women who worked here knew these streets better than any map. They remembered every stone, every puddle, every corner where you could disappear or be trapped. They knew where the sound of footsteps changed, where the cobblestones became dull, where the echoes betrayed those who walked too fast. In these places, you didn't look directly. The look was brief, calculating, like the touch of a knife, quick and precise. Here, you didn't ask for names. Names were dangerous, because if you had a name, you could be remembered. And they didn't like to remember here. There were streets where not only women disappeared. Here, sailors who got lost after the port taverns disappeared. Apprentices who didn't return to their lodgings. Guys looking for easy money and finding only darkness. The disappearance didn't look dramatic. Nobody saw a struggle. Nobody heard a scream. A person simply ceased to be part of the city. And that was the greatest danger. Because when death becomes quiet, it becomes cheap. The police knew what was happening here, but knowledge doesn't always mean action. In the reports, these places were called problem zones. In reality, they were write-off zones. Here, the risk was acceptable. Losses were expected. And life was variable. The city didn't close these streets. It allowed them to exist. Because these neighborhoods played a role. They absorbed what didn't fit into daytime London. Poverty, violence, hopelessness. And the longer they existed, the deeper the rule became. The one who disappeared here is to blame. The women knew this rule, and they lived by it every day. They went out into the night not with hope, but with calculation. How many steps to the light? How many to a dead end? How much time does it take to understand the one who is walking behind is just passing by or is already following you? There were no heroes in these neighborhoods. There was no last-second rescue. There was no justice. There was only one question that decided everything. Will they notice if you disappear? And the scariest thing, often the answer was obvious even before the night began. Because these streets were not just silent, they remembered. They remembered everyone who went too far and didn't come out. And then we come to the moment when this silence began to hide not isolated disappearances, but systemic death. Those who didn't return. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. A woman didn't show up on her usual street. Then another. Then a man who had been seen in a tavern by the docks and who never returned to the ship. London knew how to ignore such things. The city was too big, too loud, too preoccupied with its own grandeur. Disappearing at night didn't seem like an event. It seemed like part of the background. The newspapers wrote about fires, about politics, about war, about empire, about order, and the names of the missing remained between the lines, or outside them altogether, especially if they were women from the night quarters. They weren't asked about. They weren't searched for long. Their stories didn't deserve to be continued. Because these women, according to the logic of the city, had already made the wrong choice. And if they disappeared, then the night simply took its toll. But those who lived and worked in these neighborhoods noticed something else. The disappearances began to repeat themselves according to the same scenario. The same alleys, the same time, after midnight, but before dawn. The same shadows that appeared nearby and disappeared without a trace. There was no struggle. There were no screams. There were no obvious witnesses. People simply stopped appearing. And the scariest thing is, no one could say exactly when it happened, because the night erased the chronology. One of the women who survived later recalled she remembered seeing her friend that evening. They talked for several minutes. A man stood nearby, silent, well-dressed, without the smell of alcohol. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that would make him run away. But in 5 minutes, the girlfriend was gone. No scream, no noise. only the feeling that the air around him had become different, more empty. Such stories were repeated, with different names, with different faces, but always with one detail: someone nearby, someone who was impossible to describe, someone who left no trace. The police began to receive complaints, unofficial, whispers, through third parties, because no one wanted to be the first to admit something systemic was happening here. Because if it was true, then the city had lost control, and London could not allow this. A few bodies were found, not immediately, and not where they were looking. They appeared on the outskirts, by the river, in abandoned yards, in places where nothing usually happened, without obvious traces of a struggle, without an obvious cause of death, as if life had simply left the body. The doctors could not give a clear answer. The reports included phrases like exhaustion, alcohol, unknown circumstances, convenient, safe, final. But among the night neighborhoods, they already knew this was no accident. Someone had learned to take advantage of the fact that these streets had no protection. Someone understood that people could disappear here, and the city would be silent. And it was at this moment that fear changed form. It ceased to be chaotic. It became an expectation. Women began to avoid certain alleys. Men returned in groups. Conversations became shorter. Looks became more attentive. Because now the question was not, is it dangerous here? But, who is next? And then we come to the moment when the truth began to surface. And it turned out that these deaths had not only perpetrators, but also those who benefited from the silence of the night. A night that left its marks. Sometimes the city is silent for a long time, and sometimes the silence becomes too loud. London had no plans to wake up tonight. The gas lamps, as always, cast shadows on the wet pavement. The taverns closed their doors. The neighborhoods slowly lost their witnesses. The night went according to its usual script. But something went wrong. She was last seen near a narrow passage which led into a dead-end courtyard. The woman was no newcomer. She knew these streets. She knew when to leave. She knew when to say no. And that was what made her disappearance strange. Because she didn't disappear suddenly. She disappeared properly. There was no quarrel. There was no rush. There was no fear on her face. At least, that's what those who had seen her last said. She simply went where the light ended. Several hours passed. Then dawn. And as the city began to return to the rhythm of the day, someone came across something that shouldn't have been seen. The body was not found where they were looking. Not in a dark alley. Not by the river. It was found too close to life. A yard that was used during the day for unloading goods. A place that people passed by. A place that shouldn't have been part of the night's stories. And that was what made the city shudder. The body was neat. No signs of gross violence. The clothes were almost undamaged. The face was calm. Too calm. As if death had come not in a struggle, but in silence. The doctors could not agree for a long time. Familiar phrases appeared in the documents. Exhaustion, hypothermia, alcohol. But something did not add up. She was not drunk. She was not sick. She was not weak. And most importantly, she should not have died right here. Conversations began. Quiet. Unpleasant. Because if it was not an accident, then someone made a mistake. And mistakes in the night quarters usually meant that the truth came out. The women talked among themselves. They remembered that night. They remembered the man they had seen next to them. He did not look like a client. He was not drunk. He was not aggressive. He was too calm, well-dressed, clean shoes, hands without calluses. A man who shouldn't have been here. And that's what made him dangerous. The police couldn't ignore the discovery. The body wasn't lying where it could be written off. There was a report. There were interrogations. There were formal questions. But with them came a familiar desire to extinguish the story, because every answer opened a new question. Who had brought her there? Why had she left? And most importantly, why did death look so as if someone knew what they were doing? It was the moment when the night lost its anonymity, because now this story had an outline, not a face, not a name, but a direction. And that's when it became clear. These deaths are not chaos. This is a system that worked as long as it remained invisible. And in the next chapter, we'll see who had access to this silence, and why some people could enter the nighttime neighborhoods without fear. Those whom the night allowed more. The night was not chaotic. It only seemed so to those who viewed it from a safe distance. In reality, the night quarters had their own order. Unwritten, rigid, understandable only by those who had lived there long enough. Here, they knew who could walk freely, and who only with permission. There were faces that were immediately recognizable, not by their names, by the way they moved. They did not look back. They did not hurry. They did not look for light. They behaved as if the darkness was on their side. Such people did not shout. They did not threaten. They spoke softly, or were silent altogether. And that was precisely what made them dangerous. Women learned quickly. There are clients, there are criminals, and there are others. Those who did not sell their bodies, did not seek entertainment, and were not afraid of witnesses. They did not come for what money could buy. They came for power. These people knew where there were no cameras, where doors did not lock, where shouting did not matter, because they knew the main thing: night does not ask questions. Often, these were men with a daytime life, with a job, with a reputation, with a place in society. And that is why they were invisible. Because if a woman disappears from the night quarter, it is expected. And if the accusation falls on a person from the outside, it is inconvenient. And London did not like inconveniences. Rumors appeared about doctors who came too often, about employees who knew how to solve issues, about mediators who could ensure silence. No one had evidence, but everyone knew the direction. Because these people weren't hiding, they simply left no trace. If someone started talking, they quickly disappeared from conversations. Not physically, socially. They stopped trusting him. They stopped answering. They stopped letting him in at night. And that was a warning. The police also knew that there was a difference between a crime and a problem. Crime had to be investigated. A problem had to be controlled. Night neighborhoods were a problem. Convenient, regulated. They relieved tension. They absorbed sin. They allowed the city to remain clean during the day, and that's why some people were allowed more. They could enter these streets without fear of being stopped, without fear of being seen, because their presence did not disrupt the system. It fueled it. And here, the fear changed completely. Because if danger is not a random attack, but a permitted action, then the question is no longer whether you are careful. The question is whether you are comfortable. And in the next chapter, we will see the moment when someone did dare to speak out, and what happened to those who broke that silence. Those who dare to speak out silence lasts as long as everyone believes that it is safer to remain silent. In the nighttime districts of London, this rule had worked for years. People knew that some things were not to be mentioned, not to be remembered, and certainly not to be taken beyond the darkness. But every system has its limits. It comes when fear ceases to protect. The first to speak were not women. They knew that they would not be heard. Those who still had something to lose began to speak. People from the daytime, those who had accidentally touched the night and could not forget what they had seen. One of them was a young clerk who worked near the docks. He had seen the body being carried out of the alley before the police arrived. Not dramatically, without haste, as if it were part of the schedule. He remembered the face, and he remembered how quickly the silence had gone. When he tried to tell, he was advised not to exaggerate. When he insisted, he was told that he must have been mistaken. And that was the first signal. The second was a doctor, not from the central hospital, not famous, but honest enough to understand. The bodies he saw did not die by accident. The death was too neat. No signs of struggle, without chaos, as if someone knew exactly where the line between life and silence was. The doctor wrote reports, carefully, without accusations, but the reports began to get lost. He was advised to start his own practice. Then he was offered another position, away from the night quarters. That was a warning, too. But the real breakthrough came when the woman spoke. Not one of those who was easy to write off. She had survived the attack. She had not disappeared. She had not died. And she remembered. She remembered the voice, the way she moved. The smell was not of alcohol, but of cleanliness. She spoke slowly, without hysteria, without a desire for revenge. She simply wanted it to stop. Her testimony was not published. It was not printed. But they began to move among people, in whispers, in windowless rooms, in kitchens. And fear began to change direction, because now silence no longer seemed neutral. It looked like complicity. The police were trapped. To ignore meant risking scandal. To investigate meant touching those whom they were not allowed to touch. So they did what they did best. They began to imitate action. Formal interrogations, papers, commissions, and at the same time, no real step forward. But even this turned out to be enough for the system to react. The people who had spoken began to disappear from sight. Not all of them physically, but all of them gradually. Some left. Some changed jobs. Some fell silent. Because the night did not like to be brought into the light. And it was then that it became clear. Danger is not only those who operate in the darkness. Danger is what covers them. And in the next chapter, we will see how the city began to protect not the victims, but itself. When a city chooses itself. Cities, like people, have an instinct for self-preservation. And when the truth becomes dangerous, A city does not seek justice. It seeks a way to survive. London was no exception. After the first conversations, after the rumors, after the silent testimonies, something new was in the air. Not fear, not panic, but discomfort. Because now the question was different. Not whether there were crimes, but whether to let them become public. The newspapers were cautious. Small notes appeared and disappeared. Phrases like night incident or tragic accident replaced any details. The editors knew a story that was too clear was not just a headline, it was a responsibility. And responsibility in the night quarters was always dangerous. The police set up a commission. On paper, it was serious, with protocols, with seals. In reality, it was cautious. They asked the right questions, but to the wrong people. They looked in the right places, but not too deeply, because every step forward brought them closer to another question. Who allowed this to exist for so long? And the answer might turn out to be too broad. The city authorities did not deny the problem. They simply changed the wording. Instead of violence, moral degradation. Instead of murder, consequences of lifestyle. Instead of responsibility, the reality of a big city. It was a language that removed the blame and shifted it onto the victims. Because if the problem is a lifestyle, then the city is useless. The women from the night quarters suddenly became not people, but arguments. Their stories were used to prove that it's always been this way, that it can't be otherwise, that it's the price of order. And that's where the system really showed itself, because the disappearances were no longer a secret. They became acceptable. The people who tried to speak out were the first to feel it. They weren't being openly intimidated. They were simply having their doors closed. Invitations disappeared. Conversations were cut off. Names stopped being mentioned. It was a quiet, very British way of getting rid of the problem. Not through force, through isolation. And the scariest thing is that it worked, because anyone who was left alone began to doubt. Maybe he was exaggerating? Maybe it was just the night. Maybe the city really couldn't do anything. And while doubt ate away at people, the night neighborhoods continued to live by their own rules. But now they were officially ignored. It was an agreement without signatures, without announcements. The city allowed the night to exist, and the night did not interfere with the city during the day. And that's when a new danger appeared. Because when the system understands that it is not being stopped, it picks up speed. Those who used silence felt it immediately. They became bolder, less cautious, and at some point the city understood. It had lost control over the very thing it was trying to hide. Because fear no longer held back. It freed. And in the next chapter, we will come to the night when this system failed, when death became too visible, and when even London couldn't pretend that nothing was happening. A night that could no longer be hidden. The system works as long as it is invisible. It can be cruel, it can be unfair, it can be deadly. But as soon as it is noticed, it cracks. This night was not supposed to be special. It began like hundreds before it. Fog crawled along the streets. The lanterns breathed yellow light. Footsteps got lost between the walls. No one expected that something would go wrong right now. But sometimes, one little thing is enough. An extra witness, an extra light, an extra body. This time, more than one person disappeared, and not two. This time, the night left too many traces. People were found almost simultaneously, in different parts of the city. And it was unusual because the system didn't like to rush. It worked in shifts, quietly, neatly. And here, time seemed to stop. The bodies were discovered early, not after dawn, not by chance. They were seen by those who shouldn't have seen them. Workers, passers-by, those who couldn't keep quiet professionally. And most importantly, these deaths didn't fit into convenient formulations. They were too close to each other, too similar, too obvious. The newspapers couldn't ignore it, even the most careful ones. First, brief notes, then repeats, then questions that wouldn't go away. Why again? Why there? Why didn't the police react sooner? And each of these questions was not at night, but in the city. The police were forced to act, not because they wanted to, but because silence had become dangerous for the first time. Patrols appeared, not everywhere, not for long, but enough to upset the balance. And the system reacted instantly. Those who had felt untouchable suddenly became nervous, more cautious, less predictable. That made the night even more dangerous, because chaos is what comes when control weakens. Women began to disappear differently, faster, more roughly. Men stopped returning even during the day. Fear changed form. It was no longer quiet. It became nervous. People stopped trusting even familiar faces, even familiar routes. Because if the system failed, then the rules no longer worked. And the city felt it, not as a tragedy, but as a threat to its reputation. Closed meetings began, without minutes, without witnesses. They didn't discuss the victims. They discussed the consequences. How much more can you hide? Who will have to be sacrificed? And most importantly, how to regain control without admitting a mistake. Because admitting a mistake meant admitting that the night quarters were not an accident, but part of the city. And this is where the silence started to work against itself. Because when you stay silent for too long, every sound becomes suspicious. Every whisper is evidence. Every shadow is a witness. And in the next chapter, we'll see how the city did what all systems do in times of crisis. It found the culprits, those who were made guilty. When the system can no longer be hidden, it must be explained. Not honestly, but convincingly. London was not looking for the truth. It was looking for a form of closure. The city needed a story that could be told in the daytime and hidden at night. And so the guilty emerged. Not those who had enjoyed silence for years. Not those who were afraid to name. But those who were convenient to show. The poor. The lonely. People without connections. Without protection. Those for whom no one would stand as a mountain. One of them was a petty thief. He was known in the neighborhood. His name was already in the police reports. And that made him perfect. When he was arrested, the newspapers came alive. The headlines became clearer. The rhetoric became harsher. The night had a face. Not complicated, not systemic, primitive. People were offered a simple explanation. Here is the evil. Here is the reason. Here is the end. And for many, that was enough. Because complicated truth demands responsibility, and simple truth allows them to sleep peacefully. The police reported on progress, on decisive action, on the restoration of order. Patrols gradually disappeared. Commissions were dissolved. Papers were put away in the archives. Night neighborhoods returned to a familiar rhythm. But those who lived in darkness knew the night had not changed. It had only waited. Because those who were called guilty did not have access to what made these crimes possible. They did not know the roots. They had no protection. They had no permission. They couldn't be the center of the system. They were its expendable material. Some women tried to speak. They showed inconsistencies. They mentioned faces that didn't appear in the newspapers. But now they were being answered differently. The case is closed. The guilty have been found. There's no point in going back to the past. The past became inconvenient. Because if you go back to it, you'll have to admit that the guilty weren't from below, but from above, nearby, among your own. And so the story was closed, not revealed, not explained, exactly closed, like closing a door that still has someone behind it. The city pretended that the danger had passed, that order had been restored, that the night was under control again. But those who survived knew otherwise. They saw how quickly the system found not the truth, but a way out. And this knowledge was more terrifying than any attack. Because if a city is willing to sacrifice someone to maintain the appearance of order, then the question is no longer whether it is safe to live here. The question is whether you are the next one who will be conveniently forgotten. How those who were not protected survived. When illusions disappear, only a choice remains, not between good and evil, but between risk and disappearance. After the case was closed, the night neighborhoods changed not from the outside, from the inside. The streetlights stood in the same places. The alleys did not become wider. The fog still crept over the stones, but the people became different. Those who survived understood a simple thing. The city will not come. The police will not make it. The newspapers will not write. There is no help here. There is only time, and it always works against you. The women began to change their routes, every night, out of habit, without repetition. What was safe yesterday could kill today. They learned to work in pairs, not out of trust, but out of calculation. One speaks, the other looks. One stands closer to the light, the other closer to the exit. If one disappears, the other must leave immediately. No searching, no shouting, no hope. Because stopping is also a decision, and often a fatal one. The men who had to walk through these neighborhoods also changed. Sailors no longer drank alone. Workers walked in groups. Boys from the neighborhood stopped testing their luck, because now it was clear. Luck doesn't live here. It only sometimes pretends to be nearby. Unspoken rules emerged. Unwritten, unspoken. Don't go where the light hasn't changed for weeks. Don't talk to people who are too calm. Don't trust clean hands in dirty places. And most importantly, never think that this won't happen to me. Because that's how the night chose the next one. People began to read the city differently, not as a map, but as a warning, a crack in the wall, a broken lamp, an unexpected silence. All of these became signals. and if you ignored them, the city wouldn't forgive you. But even these skills didn't guarantee survival, because the real danger wasn't in the darkness. It was in the fact that someone had permission. Permission to enter. Permission to take. Permission to disappear. And while that permission existed, no rules were absolute. Some women left, changed cities. They changed their names. Some couldn't, because getting out also cost money, and the money here was always taken from the body. Those who remained lived with one knowledge: every night is a test, not for courage, not for morality, but for attentiveness, because in a city that has made its choice, not the strongest survive. Those who understand the rules in time survive. What the city did not forget. Cities have no conscience, but they do have memory. Not in the form of monuments, not in the form of dates, but in the form of habits. London lived on, as it always had. Trams ran, shops opened, newspapers found new topics, and it seemed that the night quarters had become part of the background again. But those who had lived long enough knew. Some streets never returned to ordinary life. Families settled on them less often. They were avoided. They were not shown to visitors to the city, as if the stone itself remembered too much. The houses stood the same, but the people changed. The new residents did not know the names. They did not know the stories, but they quickly learned not to ask questions, because in these places, questions had a strange property. They remained unanswered. The women who survived rarely told their stories, not out of fear, out of fatigue. They knew, even if someone was listening, it didn't mean anything would change. Some of them had disappeared from the city, forever, without a trace. And that too became part of the memory, because London was used to disappearances. It knew how to absorb people, like fog absorbs sound. Over the years, the night quarters changed their names, changed their reputations, changed their looks, but not their feelings. Some said that even the air in these alleys was different, as if it knew that it had once been normal here, not to see, not to hear, not to interfere. And this habit has survived generations. For cities transmit more than architecture. They transmit rules, unspoken, unwritten, convenient. Rules about whose death is worth paying attention to, and whose is not. Rules about when silence is peace, and when is complicity. And while the names of the missing have never made headlines, their absence has left a mark. In routes that were no longer taken, in doors that were closed earlier, in glances that lingered longer in the shadows. London has never officially acknowledged this history. It has not apologized. It has not summed up. It has simply moved on. But memory does not always need acknowledgement. Sometimes it is enough for it to not be completely erased. Because every city has places where the past is not gone. It simply stopped speaking out loud. And that is why this story is important not only for those who lived then. It is important for those who today walk down the street, not knowing how much silence lies beneath their feet. Would you be able to get out of there alive? There is a moment in every story when it ceases to be the past and becomes a mirror. London survived that night. The city did not disappear. It did not break. It did not fall. It simply adapted. The night quarters did not disappear completely. They changed shape. They changed names. They changed appearance. But the principle itself remained. Because the story of survival is not about heroes and not about victory. It is about the conditions under which survival is even possible. The people who lived on those streets back then were no braver than you, and they were no weaker. They simply found themselves where the choice disappeared before the danger appeared. They did not know what this night would be like. They did not know who exactly was taking advantage of the silence. They knew only one thing. If you're here, you're alone. No police, no system, no guarantees. And survival came down to the little things. Before whether you noticed a change in steps. Did you stop where the light was too dim? Did you trust a person who didn't look dangerous? Because in such places, danger rarely looks threatening. It looks familiar. The city has learned to live with it, and the people have learned not to ask questions. And that's exactly the scariest part of this story. Not the darkness, not the alleys, not the disappearance, but the habit. The habit of accepting that there are places where life matters less. Because if that was the case then the question isn't whether it was terrible. The question is something else. Would you recognize this moment if you were there? Would you understand that the city had already made its choice? Would you have time to leave while there was still light? Because survival stories never start with fear. They start with the feeling that everything is still normal. And only then does it become clear. You have gone too far. And that is why this question remains with us, not as a reproach, but as a test. Could you walk these streets after midnight and get out of there alive? This is not a horror story. This is history.